transport ship shook gently as it broke through Cora 7's thin cloud layer. Through the viewport, the cadets caught their first glimpse of the rugged terrain. A cracked landscape of ochre and deep rust-colored stone, interrupted by fault lines that shimmered faintly under pressure. Jagged cliffs towered above plains littered with ancient fractures, and thin trails of dust whirled like smoke in the distance. The planet was infamous for its seismic instability, and its volatile tectonic activity made it the perfect environment for the Academy's latest interspecies engineering challenge. Inside the ship's main cabin, the cadets adjusted their gear and activated climate sinks in their suits. Dozens of species from across the galactic consortium filled the chamber. Tall, multi-limbed architects from Veltrax, crystalline life forms from Dallin, and liquid-bodied engineers from Marhes. Most were already discussing seismic dampening algorithms and soil calibration sensors. Holographic blueprints floated above their wrists, animated by sleek devices and neural interfaces. Amid the cluster of advanced minds sat Tessa, the only human cadet in the group. Her backpack filled not with tools of light or synthetic alloys, but with twine, wooden pegs, handmade spades, and a notebook filled with sketched diagrams. No one looked at her twice. When the ship landed, the command voice sounded in every translator. You have 48 Quarian hours. Your assignment: construct a seismic-resistant shelter using any material found in the field or brought within your assigned volume limit. Autonomous assistance is prohibited. All shelters will be tested. Quakes are natural and unmoderated. Begin now. The bay doors opened with a hiss. The air outside was dry, metallic, and heavy with latent vibration. The planet never stood still for long. Every few minutes a tremor shifted the ground, tiny and almost unnoticeable but constant. The cadets scattered quickly, marking their zones and deploying equipment. High-tech drones burst into action, unfolding supports, scanning ground density, and mapping subsurface stress points. Tessa stepped onto the red soil and exhaled slowly. The wind carried warmth and silence. She walked without rushing, her boots leaving clear tracks in the dust, and selected a small rise between two ridges. It wasn't the highest point, nor the most sheltered, but she felt the subtle give of the earth beneath her and knew. This spot flexed instead of resisting. It would move like a wave, not snap like a board. She dropped her bag, unrolled a cloth toolkit, and knelt to press her bare palm against the soil. It crumbled softly, dry near the surface but heavier below. She smiled. Clay content. She took her water flask, poured a little into the soil, and stirred it with her fingers until it thickened. A test ball formed in her hand, held its shape, then slowly sagged. Perfect. From nearby, a pair of Veltrax students watched her and muttered to each other in clipped tones. One of them raised a long metallic arm and pointed at the string she had stretched between two small stakes. "Is that string?" he asked with a smirk. Tessa didn't look up. "Twine," she said. "Plant fiber." He tilted his head. "Is that what Earth is using now? Does it come with instructions for prayer?" His companion laughed, the sound clicking like pebbles in a can. Tessa didn't reply. She continued measuring out her shelter circle with a foot-length rod, marking the perimeter with lines in the dirt, each line aligned to the ridge's shadow and prevailing wind. Other cadets had already erected towering frameworks. A Dalan group raised an angular structure made of vibrating crystal sheets that hovered slightly above the soil. The Marhes pair formed a dome of translucent fluid, hardened briefly into shape with field locks. Their materials glowed and shimmered, responding to pressure readings from the terrain. Tessa broke a long branch from a nearby spiral tree, stripped it with her knife, then began bending it into a shallow arc. Her hands worked quickly, confidently. She drove both ends into the ground, then repeated the process until she had a ring of curved supports, a skeleton of a dome. She lashed each point with braided vine fiber, tightening it until it groaned. The structure flexed when the wind pushed it, but as she worked, more cadets passed and stared. One group even paused to take photos, laughing openly. A Dayloon technician with a body like interlocking crystal domes hovered past and addressed her in a metallic tone. "You are aware this is a seismic shelter assignment, not a child's den-building contest?" She looked at him calmly. "Yes." But he scanned the vine bindings with a probe. Organic tension structures have no yield strength beyond minimal vibration. You will collapse at the first tremor. She nodded. Not if the shelter breathes. The Dallin blinked his main node in confusion and moved on. Hours passed. The sun arced across the sky in a slow golden stretch. The ground shifted every 20 minutes now, each tremor larger than the last. Alien structures hummed as stabilization fields were tested, bracing arms deployed, foundations pressed deeper. Many cadets stood beside their nearly complete homes, admiring the perfection of their technology. Their tools adjusted with every shift in the soil, recalibrating to maintain balance. Tessa finished weaving her support lattice and stepped back. The frame was simple, 12 bowed ribs tied into a dome. She then dug clay from beneath her feet, mixed it with shredded fibers from the spiral trees, and formed handfuls of thick paste. She slapped them gently onto the dome, one by one, smoothing the layers with a wooden trowel until the entire structure took shape. Her shelter looked like a beehive made of earth, low to the ground, rounded, and soft-edged. As dusk settled, an instructor glided through the valley on a skiff, scanning each shelter. When he reached hers, he paused. "Cadet Tessa," he said slowly, "is this your final structure?" She nodded. "It is." He circled it. No base reinforcement, no field tensioning, no reactive algorithms. "No," she said. He touched the wall. It flexed slightly, warm and damp. Because this planet doesn't want to stay still," she said. "So I'm not going to force it. My shelter will move with the quake." The instructor narrowed his eyes. "And what will you do when the Earth folds?" "Breathe," she said. "And hope the shelter breathes with me." He said nothing more and moved on. As the twin moons rose and cast silver over the alien valley, the shelters stood like sentinels in the dust. Some glowed. Some hovered. Some gleamed with active plasma cores, and one, the smallest, the plainest, sat quiet and earthen, exhaling steam as it dried slowly under moonlight. Tessa lay inside it, her body curled into the floor, her cheek against the clay. She felt the tremor long before it arrived, humming in her ribs, as though the planet itself had a heartbeat. She smiled, closed her eyes, and waited for it to test her work. The first light of Cora 7's twin suns pierced through the thin atmosphere and shimmered over the fractured hills, casting long, jagged shadows that reached across the valley floor. Tessa rose from inside her half-finished dome with stiff limbs, her skin coated in a fine film of dried clay dust. The air was already warming rapidly, vibrating faintly with pressure that teased another tremor beneath the surface. She stood and rolled her shoulders, glancing across the distance at the neighboring shelters, altangular towers, floating spheres, shimmering crystal shells, all rising like monuments to technology and precision. Her own structure, in contrast, remained low and wide, its shape still more promise than form. She knelt again and resumed her work without a word. Her fingers moved rhythmically, scooping, pressing, smoothing. Each clay fiber slab she formed had been mixed by hand, using only water from her ration pack and threads stripped from Corian spiral plants she had harvested during the night. The outer wall grew slowly, layer by layer, each pressed with care not just for stability but for flexibility. The inner surface curved inward, reinforced by tightly interwoven vines that formed a fibrous basket between the ribbed wooden arches. Every few minutes, she paused to dampen the edge of a fresh layer and let it bond with the dry foundation beneath. The structure was growing like a living thing. Footsteps approached. She looked up and saw two cadets, a tall, black-scaled Virelin named Torin and a thin-boned Azari girl named Imris, both known across the Academy for their awards in structural simulation modeling. Torin folded his arms and tilted his long head. "Still wasting your hours with handwork?" he asked. Tessa sat back on her heels. "Still relying on tools that fail when the ground shifts?" Imris smirked. "You really think that pile of mud and rope is going to survive a Corian surface fracture?" "I don't know," she said. "But I do know it won't shatter." Torin stepped closer, studying her structure. "Where are your anchor roots, your shock spires, your gravitic stabilizers?" "Don't need them," she said simply. He narrowed his eyes. "Then what's holding it together?" She met his gaze. "Compression, flexibility, bonding tension." Imris scoffed and walked away. Torin followed without another word. Tessa exhaled and turned back to her wall. She didn't care if they laughed. She had read the soil maps more carefully than anyone. Cora 7's crust wasn't merely unstable, it behaved like a living membrane. It twisted laterally, not just vertically. The fractures she had studied overnight didn't snap like plates, they waved, rolled, and undulated. Structures that resisted movement cracked. Ones that flowed with it endured. The clay she worked with had just enough loam to breathe and just enough mineral weight to absorb surface shock. And the fiber netting she had woven into the dome's belly would shift slightly during movement, distributing the pressure across its surface like a ripple on water. She wasn't building to stop the quake, she was building to survive its rhythm. Hours passed. The alien shelters around her activated internal generators, self-suggesting field plates, and quake-responsive footing. Her own structure had no power core, no alloys, no reactive limbs. It only had balance, curve, and memory. By mid-afternoon, the outer shell had hardened in the sun, but the inner lining remained soft and slightly damp. That was intentional. The elasticity of the interior needed to remain until the final quake test. She smoothed the last layer near the ground, checking for small gaps in the fiber weave. Her hands were raw, and her arms ached from constant motion. But she felt a strange satisfaction in the simplicity of it. An announcement cruckled from the ridge speakers. 6 hours remain until natural seismic event. All cadets must be within their completed shelters at time of first tremor. Evaluation will begin immediately after. Tessa stood and wiped the sweat from her forehead. Her fingers left streaks of red clay across her temple. She looked around. The valley shimmered now with fully built shelters, each more dazzling than the last. A Marhes pod team had created a glowing liquid orb suspended within an energy frame. A team of Veltrax engineers had constructed a segmented tower that compressed hydraulically with every vibration, and to the west, a crystalline structure reflected the entire landscape in fractured rainbows. Her dome looked like a lump of earth, plain and forgotten. No light, no glow, no hum, just a dense shape pressed lovingly into the ground. She stepped inside. The air was cooler within. The curved roof absorbed heat slowly and radiated it gently. She crawled to the center, placed her hand on the floor, and closed her eyes. She imagined the planet's movement beneath her, like a wave rolling silently toward her from deep underground. The wind picked up. A faint tremor shifted through the ground. This one was sharp, a warning strike. She opened her eyes. The soil above her vibrated faintly. No cracks formed. The structure groaned slightly, like a reed swaying under pressure. It flexed, then settled. Outside, she heard shouting. One of the Daloon shelters had begun shifting too early. The artificial support struts miscalculated the terrain drift and failed to recalibrate. One of the outer panels collapsed with a sound like shattering ice. A team of cadets scrambled to patch the corner with emergency sealant. She remained inside, breathing slowly, counting the time between tremors. She didn't want to rush anything. She knew the real quake hadn't hit yet. The soil's rhythm was still in its shallow pulse. The deep movement came after sunset. The final step required no technology. She whispered to herself and to the dome. Now you rest, now you listen. And she waited. The sun slipped behind the far ridge like a slow-burning ember, and the warm red glow across the horizon began to fade into an eerie violet dusk. Cora 7 always held its breath before a quake. The wind quieted. The air thickened. Even the smallest creatures that had chirped earlier in the crags vanished into silence. Inside her completed dome, Tessa lay on her side. One hand pressed lightly to the floor. She could feel the subtle tremble of the planet's muscles far beneath her, slow, deep, and rising. Her dome had finished drying an hour earlier. The outermost layer had hardened just enough to hold its shape but remained slightly porous, allowing the inner fibers to breathe and expand if the pressure inside changed. She had pressed her ear against the wall just to listen to the crackling of the clay as it cooled. Not with fear, but with the quiet reverence of someone who understood. She had built a living skin, not a barrier. The alien shelters surrounding her structure glowed brightly in the dark. All across the field, the other cadets activated their seismic adaptation systems. Energy fields shimmered around the crystalline towers. Glistening shock absorption pods vibrated with low-frequency hums. Structures rose and shifted, reinforcing their bases and raising their reactive modules to full alert. Inside the Veltrax encampment, Torin barked a final systems check. Stabilizers green, pressure equalizers charged, heat anchors embedded. "The quake won't touch us," he declared proudly to his team. The others responded in unison, all confident in the precision of their high-frequency vibration dampeners and geomagnetic feedback systems. Further along the ridge, the Marhes pod housing sloshed visibly from within its containment shell, suspended in an electromagnetic grid calibrated to float just above the ground. The lead Marhes engineer, an amorphous blue form named Vile, pulsed gently in satisfaction. "Zero resistance, zero friction, maximum flexibility," he said, his voice transmitted through a translator box suspended above his center mass. No one spoke of Tessa's structure. Her dome did not hum, it did not pulse, it did not flicker or glow. It absorbed light, crouched in the soil like a stone half swallowed by the land. Most cadets assumed it would collapse at the first tremor. Some had even adjusted their perimeter algorithms to avoid being struck by its debris. But inside the dome, Tessa breathed calmly, her eyes closed, her back pressed against the curve of the wall. She wasn't waiting for the quake with dread. She was waiting for it with readiness. She had studied Earth's ancient quake shelters, especially those built by indigenous groups in regions like the Andes and the Himalayas. They hadn't built to outmuscle the mountain, they had learned to listen to it. The first major tremor hit just after the last sunbeam faded from the horizon. It didn't begin with a crack or a roar. It began with a subtle upward push, as if the whole planet exhaled from its core. Then came the second breath, longer, deeper, and the rumble began. Outside, alarms triggered across the field. Some structures began shifting early, activating micro-levitation pads or adjusting foundation stabilizers. But this quake wasn't a clean vertical pulse, it moved sideways first. The surface rippled like a rolling ocean, throwing off alignment patterns and pitching several rigid structures off max. Inside the Veltrax tower, Torin's team scrambled to reset their stabilizers. "Compensate," he shouted. "The roll isn't in quadrant theta." The tower adjusted, but the movement was too rigid. Its base groaned as the soil pulled laterally beneath it, tearing one of the hydraulic columns loose. Sparks flew from the foundation as one entire corner dipped, dragging the structure to a diagonal lean. The Marhes pod began to vibrate violently inside its field. The frictionless design had nothing to brace against. Without traction, it began to drift off its platform, slamming into the force field repeatedly with increasing speed, the internal fluid sloshing wildly. Vile shouted from inside the containment unit, but his translator only emitted garbled noise. One of the crystalline towers shattered instantly. The quake's rolling wave hit its rigid supports with perfect timing, bending its foundation at a 30-degree angle. Glass-like fragments exploded outward, peppering the ground like sharp hail. The cadets nearby dropped and rolled behind their energy shields, shielding their heads as the fragments bounced and clinked against their armor. Inside her dome, Tessa remained pressed to the ground. Her structure didn't resist a quake, it swayed with it. The dome's entire shape flexed minutely, each rib of the wooden frame bending slightly inward, then bouncing gently back as the quake passed. The fiber lattice, softened by the humidity from her body heat, tightened and released like woven muscle. The mud didn't crack, it absorbed. Her entire world creaked and moved, but never in panic. The dome behaved like a lung, inhaling the quake, then exhaling it. A second, sharper wave hit just before midnight. This one came from deep beneath the planet's fault line. It was more violent, a brutal vertical jolt followed by another lateral twist. It cracked 3 more shelters, 2 of them newer and one designed by the Daloon crystalline team. That last one fell completely, its reactive panels jamming in sequence failure. 3 cadets were forced to evacuate and stumble through the darkness, covering their heads from falling shards. Tessa's dome groaned audibly, a long, slow stretch as its core ribs bowed inward. She gritted her teeth, her palms flat on the floor, her breathing steady. Then the pressure passed, and the structure reshaped itself. The clay shifted back to its original curve. The fibers tightened again. Silence returned slowly. When the tremors finally stopped, nearly 4 minutes after they had begun, most of the field was a mess of tilted, cracked, or collapsed shelters. The sky was now fully dark. Smoke drifted from several broken generators. Sparks blinked like dying stars across the broken platforms. And in the middle of the chaos, Tessa's dome stood untouched. A Marhis cadet stumbled across the field, panting and bleeding from one shoulder. He tripped near the edge of her dome and looked up, wide-eyed as her entrance flap opened. She stepped out, her arms steady, her hair wild with dust, and extended a hand. He stared at her in disbelief. "You? You're still standing?" She nodded once and helped him in. "It's cooler inside." Another cadet saw her dome still intact and limped over. Then another. Within minutes, a small crowd had gathered around the earthen mound that had once been dismissed as primitive. Her dome became the only safe structure in the zone. She watched them enter one by one, adjusting their postures to fit the curve of the interior. As they sat and pressed against the warm, solid wall, something shifted in their expressions. Not just relief, but quiet awe. Outside, the wind began to pick up again, brushing over the fractured valley like a whisper, asking forgiveness. And inside her shelter, Tessa smiled. She hadn't needed machines. She hadn't needed approval. She had needed only to listen to the earth, to the fibers, to the past. And now, at last, the others were ready to listen too. The silence after the quake was more haunting than the chaos that had preceded it. The fractured valley of Chorus 7 no longer roared with vibration, but the wreckage whispered of what had passed. Shelters that once shimmered and hovered now leaned at sick angles, cracked like broken teeth, or lay completely collapsed into smoldering heaps of glass, metal, and failure. Soft red dust hung suspended in the air, catching the pale twin moonlight, and every breath tasted like scorched circuitry and clay. Inside the mud and fiber dome, warmth still radiated from the walls, tempered by the soil's memory of the day's heat. Tessa crouched near the entrance, her eyes scanning the terrain outside. Her posture remained alert, but her hands had relaxed. There was no triumph on her face, only a quiet watchfulness. She had known the quake would test them all. What she hadn't known was how many would come crawling out of their machines and into her simplicity. 14 cadets had now found refuge inside her dome. Some limping, some silent, one in tears. The interior, though small, held them all without stress. The curved walls cradled their hunched bodies like the ribs of a breathing animal. No sharp angles, no brittle edges. Just earth, fiber, and intention. One of the last to enter had been Torin. He had stumbled toward her dome with smoke curling from one sleeve, the left side of his suit torn where a support strut had snapped and hurled him across his own foundation. His skin was bruised beneath his scaled plating, and the smug confidence that had radiated from him just a day earlier was gone. When she opened the flap and stepped aside to let him in, he paused at the threshold. He looked at her with disbelief. "You knew it would be this bad?" She didn't nod. She didn't gloat. She simply replied, "I prepared as if it would." He entered without another word. Now, hours later, he sat near the edge of the dome, his arms crossed over his chest. His eyes remained fixed on the floor, but his ears twitched slightly with every word that passed between the cadets. Imris, the Azari girl who had mocked Tessa's use of twine and mud, now lay beside the dome's support beam, nursing a twisted ankle. She winced and pulled one of the fibrous bindings loose from her boot, replacing it with a softer strip cut from her own uniform lining. She glanced over at Tessa and muttered, "This shelter. I shouldn't have worked, but it did." Tessa was seated in the middle of the group, kneeling beside the only light source, a thermal lamp she had fashioned from clay, biothermal paste, and a salvaged glow cell. The light pulsed gently, casting shadows across the inside of the dome like a heartbeat. She was drying more plant fibers over the heat, ready to reinforce parts of the wall that had absorbed too much quake pressure. "It works," she said, "because it wasn't designed to resist, it was designed to yield." A Marhes engineer, his form half dissolved from chemical stress, shifted into a tighter coil and whispered, "We spent so long perfecting systems that counteracted force, but we forgot to observe what the force wanted to do." Tessa continued layering strips of fiber over a bent support rib, her hands moving in a patient, deliberate rhythm. Resistance fractures. Flexibility disperses. Cell, one of the Glimari twins, leaned forward and ran a pale finger along the inner dome wall. Her skin glittered faintly in the light, and her voice sounded fragile. "This feels like something grown, not built." "It was both," Tessa answered. "I let the material tell me what it could become." Torrin finally lifted his eyes. His voice was hoarse. "You made this by hand." "I did." "No scanners, no diagnostics, just instinct?" "No," she said. "Not instinct, observation, study, time." He looked down again. A long silence passed. The only sounds were the slow breaths of exhausted cadets and the occasional creak of the dome stretching with temperature change. Then the ridge speakers crackled. "All cadets prepare for inspection. Recovery vessels entering orbit. Surface evaluation begins in 40 minutes. There was a collective murmur. One cadet groaned. Another laughed bitterly. Someone muttered, "Let them inspect what's left of my failure." Tessa stood and stretched her arms, rolling the tension from her neck. "You should go check your sections. Whatever's still standing might be counted." Imris grimaced. "Mine isn't standing. It folded like paper." "Then it still has something to teach you." Torrin pushed himself to his feet. "What about yours?" Tessa looked around the dome, then at him. "Mine's still here." He stared for a moment longer, then moved toward the flap and stepped out into the cool air. The others followed slowly, some limping, some quiet. Tessa remained behind until the last cadet had exited. She brushed her hand along the inside of the dome one final time, then stepped outside. The landscape was scarred. Even in the dim morning light, it was clear that most shelters had suffered catastrophic failure. Scorched support beams jutted from the ground like broken bones. Transparent shells had collapsed inward, forming puddles of glossy shards. Entire foundations had shifted off their supports and split open. Only one dome stood whole. Hers. Within the hour, the recovery skiffs descended. Their hulls gleamed beneath the haze as instructors disembarked, drones following behind with scanning lights and seismic survey probes. One of the lead evaluators, an instructor from Dalun with 4 blue lenses and silver-traced arms, approached Tessa as the scans of her shelter completed. He stood silently, then asked, "What materials?" She answered evenly. "Spiral plant fiber, subsurface clay, dried reed binding, wooden trowel, flint edge, rope." He turned to another instructor. "Survived a Category 6 lateral displacement. Internal pressure variation minimal. Structural integrity 100%. He looked back at her. "No power? No calibration systems?" "No." He stared at the dome. This structure should not have remained intact. Tessa didn't flinch. It remained because it listened. There was no immediate reply. Then Torrin stepped forward, his arms at his sides. His voice was clear. It worked because she wasn't trying to outbuild the quake. She let the planet guide her hand. The instructor turned to him, raised one metallic brow, and then faced Tessa again. "We will need a full schematic," he said. "I didn't make one," she replied, "but I can show you." The instructor held her gaze for a moment longer, then nodded slowly. Tessa looked up toward the rising light. The wind shifted softly again. It was no longer a threat. It was an echo of something respected. Her shelter had not stood against the quake. It had stood with it. By mid-morning, the evaluation process had reached its peak. Columns of survey drones drifted across the torn surface of Cora 7, scanning what remained of each shelter with quiet efficiency. From her place beside the still-standing dome, Tessa watched as cadets moved stiffly across the field. Bandaged, silent, some humbled into reflection, others still stunned into disbelief. She had seen the way the instructors walked now, not with the casual gait of superiority, but with the quiet, deliberate steps of people who had witnessed something unexpected and were still processing how to categorize it. Her dome had become the anchor of the assessment zone. The instructors circled it again and again, some in silence, others muttering in fragmented technical terms, as if trying to make sense of its very existence. No one had expected it to survive. No one could deny now that it had. It stood without external support, without powered systems, without a single reinforced joint, and still it stood, firm and steady, having weathered the same seismic wave that had reduced technological marvels to wreckage. An instructor from the Terran division approached her, his weathered uniform streaked with dust, a stylus in one hand and a tablet in the other. He had a kind face but spoke with the clipped rhythm of someone used to efficiency. "Fidelia, do you have formal documentation for your design?" She shook her head. "No digital plans. I kept my notes in a journal. Drawings, proportions, fiber ratios. May I see them?" She reached into her bag and pulled out a thick, mud-stained notebook. Its cover was made of pressed bark and secured with a hand-twisted loop of vine. She opened it and handed it to him. He flipped through the pages with growing interest. Ink diagrams showed arcs and tension calculations, not by laser grid but by hand, marked with annotations about soil absorption rates, wind flow, and fiber elasticity. Mud fingerprints covered the edges. None of it had the polish of a formal blueprint. But every line was purposeful, every measurement real. "This," he said slowly, "was not improvised." "No," she replied. "I studied quake-prone environments for months before the challenge. Earth cultures knew how to build with balance, not resistance. I just adapted it to what I found here." He nodded absently, still flipping. "You anticipated the lateral roll of Cora's crust. You built low, allowed for compression, distributed tension instead of trying to neutralize it. This is ancient engineering, cadet. Not primitive, purposeful." She said nothing. She didn't need to. Behind him, a group of instructors stood in quiet conference. Their voices were low, their expressions unreadable. Then one of them, an older Dowloon professor with deep violet markings along her brow, broke from the group and approached. She was taller than the others, her shoulders draped in a sensor-threaded shawl that shimmered faintly even under dust. "I am Instructor Palray," she said without introduction. "Your shelter is the only structure on this field that remains structurally sound across all measured frequencies. We reviewed your materials. Nothing was synthetic. You used no reinforcement compounds, no adaptive mesh, no powered systems. And yet your dome flexed with the surface. It held internal cohesion. It protected occupants beyond its intended capacity. How do you explain that?" Tessa straightened. "I didn't try to overpower the plant. I watched what it did, then built something that could follow its movement instead of fighting it." Palray tilted her head. "Do you believe this design could be replicated in other tectonic zones?" "With regional adaptations, yes. Each environment has its own rhythm. The materials will differ, but the concept is universal." Palray turned to her colleagues. "We need to begin simulation modeling, introduce her patterns into Cortex Adaptive AI, cross-rex it with existing shelter modules." Tessa spoke before she could finish. "I'd rather keep it manual." Palray raised one eyebrow. "Manual? If you let the system automate the build process, it'll optimize for efficiency, not feel, not adaptation. You'll lose the sensitivity that makes the structure work. You would forego global deployment?" "I'd train builders instead," Tessa said. "Let them build with their hands. Let them feel the earth move under them. Then their shelters will hold." Palray studied her in silence for a long time. Then she said, "What will you name it?" Tessa hesitated. She turned toward the dome, its surface still warm under the morning light. Its shape was simple, but it belonged to the land now, formed by hands, pressure, time, and the silent consent of the planet itself. "Let it be called Earth Song," she said. Palray repeated the word softly, almost reverently. Earth Song. The instructors noted it down. That afternoon, the final rankings were announced in a quiet, unofficial gathering. No podiums, no medals. Just a readout on the main camp board. Tessa's name stood alone at the top of the seismic engineering evaluation, above every name from every technical world, every high-tier academy, every team. She was offered a faculty mentorship on the spot. She accepted, but only on the condition that she be allowed to design a training module in field-based tactile construction. When asked to give a speech to the other cadets, she declined. Instead, she gave them reed samples, showed them how to test soil density with their feet, and spent an hour teaching Imrus how to braid binding fibers by hand. Torrin approached her before the departure ship arrived. His arm was still in a sling, but his voice had regained its steadiness. "I mocked you," he said. She nodded. "I thought the dirt on your hands meant you didn't understand the challenge." She looked at her hands. "It meant I was already inside the solution." He smiled faintly. "Do you think we'll ever stop choosing control over listening? Only if we choose to start listening first." The ship's engines rumbled across the field. Tessa turned back toward Earthsong. Instructors had marked its perimeter for relocation to a research facility on Cora's stable pole. Scientists would study it, try to digitize it, maybe replicate it. But she hoped someone would simply sit inside it and feel the pulse in the floor. That was the real secret. Not the materials, not the dome, not the clay. It was the humility to bend with the ground instead of mastering it. As the ship lifted, she looked down once more at the valley. A place where machines had fallen, but a handmade shelter had stood. A place where engineers laughed until the earth answered.